And it's PLB with Basketball News, back with another video. In today's video, I'm going to be reacting to Bleacher Report's grading every NBA general manager's moves from the past 3 seasons. So, I'm going to give them my own grade, and I'm going to react to Bleacher Report. So, if you like this kind of content on the channel, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you get notified whenever I upload. And make sure to check out my baseball channel. It is PLB with MLB News, and my football channel, PLB with Football News. So, yeah, let's go ahead and react to this article. So, the incomplete trades, they're going to go with the Chicago Bulls, Denver Nuggets, and Detroit Pistons. I would assume the Pistons incomplete grade is just because who knows how the Andre Drummond trade will pan out for them. And I don't know why the Denver Nuggets or Chicago Bulls are on there. We move on and start with the Atlanta Hawks, where they get an A- from Bleacher Report. And they made an okay trade, and they got Trae Young from. They could have Luka Doncic right now, but they have Trae Young, who is still a really good player. I think it's probably just as good of a player as Luka Doncic. And Cam Reddish in the first round of the 2019 draft might be the only mistake right here. Number 4 overall, drafting DeAndre Hunter in 2019. I don't know if a 3-and-D player. I think his comparison would be more like a Robert Covington, but he got drafted fourth overall. And they drafted John Collins 19th overall in 2017. Now, that is actually a really good pickup for them because John Collins could have gone higher in that draft because he actually is a decent player. Yes, he's asking too much for a max contract, but still, he is a good player. And then they traded for center Clint Capella in 2020. I don't know if that would be a big transaction. I think they could also put Dwayne Dedmon on here because Dwayne Dedmon was a big acquisition for them, in my opinion. He can shoot the three a little bit now, and he has an okay mid-range shot, and he can be a traditional center as well. So they gave an A-. I think I would give them more of a B+, would be more accurate, because you don't know how DeAndre Hunter, John Collins, because they could lose John Collins, which could put them lower as a grade, and plus Cam Reddish has not really panned out to be that great yet, and DeAndre Hunter, I think they took maybe too high, if that makes any sense. So next we go on to the Boston Celtics A. That's probably what I would have gave them because obviously they signed Kemba Walker to a 4-year, $141 million deal in 2019. They also won the Kyrie Irving trade. Yes, Kyrie Irving only spent, what was it, like 2 or 3 years there, but I still think they won that trade. And they traded Isaiah Thomas, which was really good for them. They traded Jay Crowder, who was good for them, but still. And then they traded the number 1 overall pick in 2017 for number 3 overall pick Jason Tatum. And that meant that the 76ers got Markelle Fultz, lost this trade, and the Celtics moved down and got the better player. The 2019 first-round pick, Romeo Langford, is not that great, but still, I think he could pan out to be okay. Now, they signed Gordon Hayward to a 4-year, $128 million deal. Now, he's been injured for most of the time, so it's not that great of a signing, but at the time they signed him, I understand why they would have signed him because he had the ability to be a future MVP, in my opinion. Now we go on to the Brooklyn Nets, who is definitely going to get an A. I think that's pretty obvious. They got D'Angelo Russell. They also got Kevin Durant in a sign-in trade. And they signed Kyrie Irving, which I don't think that's going to really do that great for them. And then they drafted Jared Allen in 2017, which was a really good pickup for them. The next one we move on to is the Charlotte Hornets, which gets a C-. So, yes, the Kemba Walker is definitely a loss, But look at Terry Rozier's stats for 2019, and he actually has been pretty good. They drafted P.J. Washington, number 12 overall in 2019, who I definitely think is going to be probably their best player in the future. You also have Devontae Graham. They traded Shai Gilgeous-Alexander for Miles Bridges, which is one trade that I just think they lost. I still think Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is going to be a really good player. And I don't think he's better than Miles Bridges, and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander he could play a small forward position as well, and signed Tony Parker, which was good for that year. And he retired after the 2018 season, I'm pretty sure. We go to the Cleveland Cavaliers, which gets a C. I think they have to get more of a D or an F for me. Not very good. They traded John Hitson and Brandon Knight for Andre Drummond, who is an overpriced center. They drafted Darius Garland, who I think is going to be a draft bust in the future. They drafted Kevin Porter Jr., who I think is going to be better than Darius Garland. They signed Kevin Love to an extension, which is kind of overpriced. And they traded Kyrie Irving to the Celtics for Isaiah Thomas, Jay Crowder, and they eventually got Colin Sexton as well. And that is really the main trade that they lost, and that's the Andre Drummond trade and the Kyrie Irving trade is the main reason I would put them in the D tier. We move on to the Dallas Mavericks, which gets an A. It makes total, complete sense. They made sure to get Kristaps Porzingis back on a deal. And they had to trade a lot for Kristaps Porzingis, Trey Burke. They also had to take the contract of Tim Hardaway and Courtney Lee, but that's okay. And they also had the Trae Young and Luka Doncic trade, which a lot of people will say the Hawks lost that trade. I don't think so. I think Trae Young and Luka Doncic are going to be both great players. And then they drafted Dennis Smith Jr., who did not really stay there for that long, which I think they kind of wasted a pick in 2017 on him, but that's besides the point. The Warriors are going to get a B. I don't know how much I agree with this. I think they have to get an A, at least for me. And that's just because in the sign and trade in the Kevin Durant trade, they got D'Angelo Russell back, where they could have got nothing back. They signed Steph Curry to a 5-year, $201 million deal in 2017. So he'll be there to 2022. And they signed Klay Thompson to a 5-year, $190 million deal in 2019. And they signed Draymond Green to 4 years, $100 million, which I think is a little overpriced for a defense main player, but I get that. And the D'Angelo Russell Andrew Wiggins trade is the one trade that I think they definitely lost. Now we go to the Houston Rockets, which gets a B plus, and they traded Clint Capella, Gerald Green for Robert Covington and Jordan Bell, which Robert Covington I think fits well with what they have in Houston. Now trading Clint Capella, no. But Jordan Bell also, I think, could be a good player. He is one of those players that I have just not given up on yet. And the Chris Paul trade, I think they won that trade, even though Russell Westbrook is rumored in trades. They signed James Harden to a 4-year, $170 million contract extension in 2017. And they traded Patrick Beverley, Montrezl Harrell, Lou Williams, and that for Chris Paul, which is a trade that I think they lost. And Montrezl Harrell, I think, could be a good player. We move on to the Indiana Pacers, where they get a B+, and I think they could get higher than a B+, just because they signed Domantas Sabonis, who I think is going to be a really good player. They also signed Malcolm Brogdon, and they also got T.J. Warren for literally not much of anything, second-round picks. We go on to the Los Angeles Clippers. A, that's pretty obvious. They signed Kawhi Leonard. They won the Paul George trade, in my opinion. Now, yes, they gave up a lot of picks and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, which is the main part of that trade because Danilo Gallinari obviously is going to be a free agent. They traded Tobias Harris for Landry Shamet, pretty much. and that's an okay trade. They also traded Miles Bridges for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, which is a trade as a Hornets fan that I don't really like. I wish the Hornets would have kept Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And they traded Blake Griffin, Bryce Johnson, and Willie Reed to the Detroit Pistons for Avery Bradley, Tobias Harris, and Boban Bogdanovic. And I actually don't mind the Blake Griffin trade for the Clippers. And they got Avery Bradley back, who's a good shooter. They also got Tobias Harris back, who actually was really good with the Clippers. The Los Angeles Lakers get a B. I don't know that I agree with that. Now, they did give up Brandon Ingram. I'll give them that. And that's probably one piece that they can't replace. They also signed Danny Green, LeBron James, Larry Nance Jr., and Jordan Clarkson to the Cleveland Cavaliers for Isaiah Thomas and Channing Frye. Going on to the Memphis Grizzlies, which gets a B+, and I think they could even get higher because I think they won the Mike Conley trade, because I think Mike Conley is kind of not going to be that good for the rest of his career. They also got John Morant, who definitely a win. Jonas Valanciunas, which is one of the more underrated players in the NBA, who is definitely going to be pretty good for them. Dylan Brooks, they kind of overpaid for, but I understand why. They do kind of need a shooter. They also traded Jay Crowder, Solomon Hill, and Andre Iguodala for Justice Winslow and Dion Waiters. Pretty much Justice Winslow, to be honest. I think they could have kept Jay Crowder, which would have gave them a good small forward, or Solomon Hill, one of the other. Now we move on to the Miami Heat, where this gets an A+, and I would have to agree with them. They've got Andre Iguodala. They traded Josh Richardson and Hassan Whiteside for Jimmy Butler, which is a trade that I don't really agree with that they did. And that's just because Hassan Whiteside has actually done pretty well with the Portland Trailblazers. And Josh Richardson has done okay, and I think him and Jimmy Butler could have fit really well. But they did draft Tyler Hero. They signed Kendrick Nunn, Duncan Robinson, and drafted Bam Adebayo. So I think they could even possibly get an A+. So we move on to the Milwaukee Bucks, where they get a B+. They signed Chris Middleton to maybe an overpriced deal. Same with Brook Lopez after he just had that one good season. And they traded John Henson, Matthew Dellavedova to the Cleveland Cavaliers, which Matthew Dellavedova is one that I think they should have kept just because I think he could be a good backup point guard. They signed their head coach, which is a really good head coach. They traded Greg Monroe for Eric Bledsoe, which is actually an okay trade because Greg Monroe didn't spend that long with the Phoenix Suns. The Minnesota Timberwolves get a B+. I think they could possibly get an A- even. That's just because they won that D'Angelo Russell trade, in my opinion. And they did not really win this trade right here with the Robert Covington and Malik Beasley. But I think Malik Beasley is going to be good for them. I think Evan Turner is one that they should have played more while they did have them before the NBA season was suspended. They also got Dario Saric, they traded Dario Saric to the Phoenix Suns, who is okay. They also traded Jimmy Butler and Justin Patton to the Philadelphia 76ers. So they did see the one trade here at last is Zach LaVine, Chris Dunn, and Lauri Markkanen to the Chicago Bulls, which is really one that I think they lost. And that's just because I think Zach LaVine's going to be a really good player, and I think he would fit well in a big three of Russell, Towns, and LaVine would be really good. And I think Lauri Markkanen is actually going to be really good. We go on to the New Orleans Pelicans, where they give an A, and I would have to agree with them. Yes, they gave up Anthony Davis, but Anthony Davis could opt out of his contract with the Lakers, and then they would pretty much get Brandon Ingram, Lonzo Ball, and Josh Hart and some picks for pretty much giving up one season to the Lakers of Anthony Davis. They drafted Zion Williamson, which obviously is a win. They also drafted Jackson Hayes, who I think is really going to be a good player one day. And they also traded for Derek Favors, and they signed J.J. Redick to a good deal for as good of a shooter as he is. The Knicks get a D+, and that's an okay grade. They drafted R.J. Barrett, who I think is going to be a really good player down the line. Yes, he didn't really have the greatest first season, but still. They traded Carmelo Anthony to Oklahoma City for Enes Kanter, Doug McDermott. Enes Kanter had that good season in one season with the Knicks, and Doug McDermott had an okay season, and Mitchell Robinson is probably the main player that they got here, and they traded Kristaps Porzingis, Tim Hardaway, Courtney Lee, and Trey Burke to the Dallas Mavericks, which is definitely a trade that they lost, and I think R.J. Barrett and Kristaps Porzingis and Julius Randle as a big three could actually be really good. Move on to the Oklahoma City Thunder, which gets an A, and I don't really know how. They got Chris Paul, which I'll give them, that's pretty good, and Delino Gallinari, who's been pretty good for them, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and a ton of picks. And they signed Paul George and Russell Westbrook to contracts, which I don't know why they put them on there because they're no longer on that team. But they traded Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis for Paul George. Now, Domantas Sabonis and Victor Oladipo have been really good for the Pacers. Now, are they better than Paul George? No, but still, I would give them more of a B, just because they do have to take on this terrible Chris Paul contract right here, and they had to pay Delino Gallinari for 1 year. But minus that, they pretty good. Next is the Orlando Magic, where I think they could get better than a C, probably a B here, just because they signed Nikola Vucevic. They got Jonathan Isaac, who, yes, they lost. I mean, Mo Bamba's not that good. And they traded for Markelle Fultz, who is one of the bigger draft busts. The Philadelphia 76ers get a C, and I think they could get more of a B or an A on here, and that is just because they signed Ben Simmons, they got Al Horford, they got Tobias Harris, they got Josh Richardson for Jimmy Butler in a sign and trade, and they didn't give up that much for Jimmy Butler. They only gave up Robert Covington, really, in my opinion. Next, we go on to the Phoenix Suns, which gets a C-, and I don't really know why. Because Kelly Oubre, I think they got him on a really good contract. Jarrett Culver, they gave up to Minnesota, which is a loss. They traded Trevor Ariza to Washington for Kelly Oubre, which Kelly Oubre, I think, is going to be really good for them one day. I think Kelly Oubre, Ricky Rubio, or whoever they get in the 2020 draft could be a really good big three. We move on to the Portland Trailblazers, which gets a B. And I have to agree with him. B seems about accurate because C.J. McCollum, Damian Lillard, they signed Carmelo Anthony to a cheap contract when you never really know what he was going to have. And they got Trevor Ariza, which is not great. But they signed Yusuf Nurkic to an okay contract. Not a great contract. Sacramento Kings get a D+, and that's probably just because they have a lot of draft busts. Starting off with Harry Giles, Marvin Bagley, I think, is still a draft bust. De'Aaron Fox is not. They signed George Hill to a terrible contract. They smartly traded Harrison Barnes. Well, they smartly traded Zach Randolph is what I meant. And they got Harrison Barnes back, which is an overpriced contract. And then they gave him a huge extension. And they gave Buddy Hield a huge extension. The San Antonio Spurs get a C. I think they could get more of a D. And it says they signed DeJounte Murray to a 4-year, $64 million deal in 2019, which is a move that I kind of like for the Spurs. And they waived Amari Carroll, which who really cares? Toronto Raptors get an A, and I would have to agree with them because they signed Patrick Siakam before he even hit free agency, and they did lose Jonas Valanciunas, who is now really good for the Memphis Grizzlies, for Marc Gasol. They traded DeMar DeRozan and for Danny Green and Kawhi Leonard, which is a good trade because they got Danny Green, who is a good 3-and-D player, and they got Kawhi Leonard, who is great at defense, great at offense. They signed Kyle Lowry to a 3-year, $100 million deal in 2017. Yes, that's overpriced. And Serge Ibaka, same thing. We move on to the Utah Jazz, where this is going to get a B. I don't know how much I agree with this, and that's just because I don't agree with the Mike Conley trade that they did. I think they gave up Jay Crowder and Kyle Korver is the main pieces of that trade. They also gave up Derek Favors to New Orleans for second-round picks. And they signed Bojan Bogdanovic to a 4-year, $73 million contract, which I see why they did because he did have a good season with the Pacers. They traded Dante Exum for Jordan Clarkson, which was a good trade for them. We move on to the Washington Wizards, which I think is going to be one of the last ones on this list. I think they could even get higher than a C+ on this. I think they could definitely get a B just because they drafted Roy Hachimura. They signed Isaiah Thomas to a cheap contract, and they signed Thomas Bryant. They traded for Davis Bertans, who I think Davis Bertans, Bradley Beal, and Roy Hachimura as a big three could be really good. And they signed Bradley Beal to a 2-year, $72 million extension. Now, I see why they are at C+, and that's just because they do have the terrible John Wall contract. So yeah, that's going to be the end of this video. If you like this kind of content on the channel, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, turn on notifications so you get notified whenever I upload. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back with more videos soon.